Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the Masculine Wilderness Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Perez. I am the founder and CEO of Epic Project. This is an ongoing conversation about the way men show up in the world and also how women show up to help in that process. I have learned a ton over the years about something that I've loved my whole life, and that is stories. Whether they're stories we sit around and tell as family members or stories that are more polished and developed like a good book or a movie. And one of the common variables in every good story is there's always a wizard or an elder or a mentor, some mysterious figure that shows up at what seem like random times, but they actually end up being really important times for the characters in the story. And today I am thrilled to introduce to you one such wizard who showed up in my story and helped me, frankly, tell better stories. Cami Ostman is here. And Cami, would you just tell us, I got a ton of questions. I have a list of questions for you, and we've talked enough to know that I don't really need a list of questions, but tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I live in Seattle, Washington, and I grew up here. I've traveled all around the world, been to all 7 continents, but landed right back here where I started. I run an organization called the Narrative Project. We help writers get their books done, and we also help people work with their life narratives. And another little company called Wayfaring Writers, where my partner and I take people on trips so they can hone their writerly skills and have adventures. I'm a runner, a dog lover, a wine connoisseur, a big fan of story.
Obviously, you have been a teacher. You're still a teacher.
Yes.
But you wore that hat for a while. You're a therapist with significant training in trauma therapy and narrative therapy, and we'll talk about that because all of those things have shaped your life. So I first connected with you a few years ago at the recommendation of our dear friend, Lauren Trentham, our producer, and started as a member of a cohort in the Narrative Project. And can you explain, like in a nutshell, the goal of that? You kind of already said it, but like explain what the Narrative Project is for someone coming in as a wannabe writer.
Yeah, sure. So yes, my background as an educator, my undergraduate degree was in English and theater, secondary education, and then my master's degree in marriage and family therapy. So both of those fields are heavily dependent on understanding how stories work. And so when it was time for me to start my own business, a friend of mine said, you should really help writers get their books done because you're good at getting things done. And I said, oh, that's true. I really am. And so sort of in the air between us appeared this process whereby we bring people in for 9 months of writing. And I have a pedagogical process where I help them build skills over the 9 months that we're together, receive critique on their work, make sure that they're clear about their story arc and what we call the guiding question. So they get support and accountability and skills building all along the way. And at the end of the first 9 months, the idea is they emerge with a draft that they can revise. Really good, deep storytelling requires some revision. Don't believe anybody who says you can write your memoir in 6 months and publish it, poof.
Yeah. I have to admit, when I started the process, I did it. I didn't know you, but I did it because Lauren said I should, and I know her. And my first few impressions, I can still see the Zoom screen in my mind's eye and my memory, and it's me and 30-some women.
Right.
I was the lone guy. And then, like you said, there's a whole sequence of things and exercises, processes that you help work people through. And originally I thought, wow, this feels a little woo, but it didn't take long for me to realize there's some serious trade craft being communicated and taught in a really effective way. And so It was really, really challenging for me. And so I had, like I said, I was the only guy. And the way it works is we have larger group training, teaching sessions, and then the critiquing, which happens in smaller groups with a coach and usually 3 or 4 writers, right?
Right.
And that's really the meat of it right there.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where the hard work is, where we were writing regularly and coming together over Zoom, and we would pair up and have each other's work, and some of it was really, and your writers have been from all over the world, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
We've had writers from as far away as Mongolia or South America and Europe.
Yeah.
So most of them are North American, and most, in fact, are West Coast in the United States. But we definitely have had people from all different time zones.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. It was, the only word that comes to mind is sobering, but that doesn't feel like the best word, but I'll use it. It's sobering for me as a man. And I am writing a book about kind of my own masculine journey over the years, being involved in the work against sex trafficking and what that has meant. But I was up against, because that's what it felt like initially, I was up against some serious feminists, and I say that with great respect because
I know
think
you do.
It deserves great respect, but some serious feminist thinkers who didn't put up with my crap in my writing. And anytime I tried to duck things like saying how I really felt, they called me out on it over and over again.
Yeah.
And
I'll keep you honest.
It does. And but as I've thought about the experience, so I did this for 2 years. Mm-hmm. And what I've realized is it's very similar experientially for me to the discipline I had to submit myself to in athletics. Uh-huh. There are a whole bunch of things that just really suck.
Yeah.
But they're so foundational to success that if you refuse, it's like you're shooting yourself in the foot. Yeah. And that's what this felt like. There are so many of these things that are, and I have not achieved a level of proficiency that I want yet with some of the things that you taught me, but it was hard to learn those in the company of women.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah. And yet they held space for me, which is really weird. It felt really weird at times. I didn't feel like I deserved it for one thing. Just in light of what I know about the world. So we come back to that. I wanted to, if you could unpack a little bit about, we talked about the trade craft of writing and we can go into the weeds on that, but you also blend something in there that was unexpected for me, and that is your understanding of trauma.
Right.
And how that affects the stories we tell with our lives. Or can you dive into a little bit of that? Because where does that come from for you?
Well, so my work as a therapist, people opt into therapy because they have some pain that they're working with, and the pain often comes from trauma. I think people often opt into writing a memoir in particular, but also novels. I mean, because there's something they're working out, or there's something they've worked out, like there's been a trauma or some pain, and they've had a transformation and they want to share what they've learned with other people. So it's my assumption when people come in and they're writing about their own lives that they probably are starting out from a place of pain. And so in order to write all the way through that, Tom, I mean, yes, you need the skills. You need to know how to build a character. You need to know how to write dialogue and create a voice on the page. But you have to be able to have a good relationship with anxiety. Because
say more about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Because as you write, there's a number of things that will come up for people as they write, particularly as they write their own stories. And you said one of them, like, I'm not sure I deserve to write this. It's this, what we call the inner critic. I mean, that's a kind of a pop psychology term for the parts of us that are trying to keep us safe from things that happened a long time ago. So I quickly understood, I didn't at first create the program with the inner critic, the full inner critic course as part of it. But I quickly understood that unless we were going to help people calm the anxiety, to have a relationship with anxiety such that anxiety wasn't running the show and trying to protect them from things that happened when they were little kids.
Yeah.
they weren't going to be able to write their books. So we started I say we because I have a team, the Inner Critic Relief Program, which is 6 weeks of really looking at the inner managers, those voices inside of our heads, which speak loudly and their job is to keep us safe, but they can be mean sometimes.
Yeah.
The inner manager is very people pleasing. And for a lot of women, it's very people pleasing. Like, we'll do anything to make that person happy so that we're safe. For men, it isn't always people pleasing. Sometimes there's a taskmaster where you feel like what you're doing on the page, it's not really legitimate. It's not real work. You should be doing these other things. So those voices they're always really there with our best intention in mind, but they don't seem like it.
Yeah.
So I lean heavily on a theory called internal family systems, which is a theory designed by Richard Schwartz that I learned about in my master's program. And I've sculpted the content of that along with some narrative therapy to create an inner critic process for writers specifically so that they can get their stuff on the page.
So it's not necessarily how to just shut down that inner critic. It's how to manage it more effectively.
Yeah. I mean, I mentioned this to you that I loved your podcast with Justin.
Yeah.
Because of the way that you talked about really supporting people when you're interrupting a transaction, really supporting people in coming into community.
Yeah.
And this is what we do with the mean voices in our heads. And you'll sometimes hear people talk about like, kill off the inner critic or something like that. And my thing is like, if you're mean to a part of yourself, if you're self-hating, that just breeds more violence. So the internal family systems process is really one of listening to what is the intent of that voice and helping it to calm down, really by showing it that the danger isn't there anymore. I mean, that's the short version of it.
Yeah. That was for me very surprising when I was exposed to that. And I still, to be fully transparent, I think I still have a ton of work to do on that. The inner critic. It's my wife and I tell a story. We rented a jet ski one day and she wanted to drive. And I'm usually the guy, I'm the one that drives. And so she said, no, you're on the back. And so she just hits it full throttle and we're bouncing across this lake. And I was so out of control that I reached my hands around her and grabbed control of the steering wheel. And we had a fight right there in the middle of the lake. And she said, that's it. Taking you back, you get your own. But I feel that's the inner critic for me.
Yeah.
He keeps wanting to take control and
that's an ongoing thing, Tom. I've been doing the internal family systems work with myself regularly for a couple of decades.
Yeah.
But those parts are very persistent. So you're in a relationship with those parts ongoingly.
Yeah. So for you, like this, both the therapy and the narrative project and all of that work you're doing isn't just some disconnected academic pursuit for you. Like this came from somewhere. I mean, it's clear when, hopefully folks that listen will get to experience this, but can you share a little bit, whatever is comfortable for you, where that comes from for you?
Yeah. Well, so for me, my background is, if you go way back, my parents were teenagers when my mom got pregnant. And she's mentally ill. And my dad is a recovering alcoholic and drug addict now. But until I was 19, he was using pretty heavily. They got divorced when I was about 9 and my mom remarried pretty quickly. And so I came out of my childhood with a ton of pain. And I could see that things weren't right. I definitely needed some extra support. And so I leaned into a church. My friend took me to church. And I will never have a bad thing to say about the people who embraced me at the churches. I've since left the doctrine behind, but I really do feel like family wrapped their arms around me and kept me safe. So that's where I found my stability and a lot of the structure. Now, as time progressed, I could see that there were problems in what I was being taught as well, because as a woman, I was being taught that I needed to remain silent in the church. It was a pretty strict group.
Yeah.
And to remain silent, and also that I needed to always have a man as my headship. And I could see that this was not going to work for me as a woman, and particularly as a woman who, in my family, I'm the oldest and I have 3 younger brothers. So you've heard me say this before, but I'm always a little confused when men don't do what I tell them to do.
You have lived experience that suggests the opposite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh gosh, even my little brother was over the other day and he got mad at me and stood up like he was going to storm out. And I just gave him the glare and said, "Sit back down." He said, "Okay, we'll talk it out."
Yeah.
But anyway, that didn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
That I should be subject. And so eventually I needed to unpack that and to leave. And so I think from very early on, Tom, I was digging into self-help and how-to and psychology, which is what eventually led me to determine that I needed to go into therapy school. Not just therapy, did that too, but also therapy school.
Therapy school.
Thinking you're going to save your family, but you don't. You save yourself.
Was there a wizard that showed up for you at any point in that part of your story?
Yes, there was a couple of them during grad school. I had a professor who was really deep into narrative therapy. And I was coming from what we would call a modernist perspective, where there's one way of looking at reality. And narrative therapy comes from the idea that there are multiple ways of looking at reality, multiple stories that can be told about a thing. And I was very resistant to that idea at the beginning. And she was endlessly patient with me as I grappled with the two, what I saw as, I don't anymore, but what I saw as opposing ideas.
Yeah.
And then there was a second professor, his name was Tom also, and he was a Greek Orthodox priest.
Wow.
And he was literally the most loving human ever. So between those two, they just really embraced me and shepherded me through.
Wow. That's like the head and the heart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was.
That's beautiful. That's so cool. I've heard you share a lot of stories. I haven't heard that one.
Yeah.
That's really cool. How long were you in therapy practice?
About 20 years.
Okay. So you've been in it a long time.
Yeah.
Why is narrative, well, first, what is narrative therapy? And then if we can bridge from that to the writing and the process, what is narrative therapy and why are narratives so critical for us as a part of our lives?
Right. So narrative therapy is a theory designed by Michael White and some of his collaborators. He's passed, but he was Australian. And it's the idea that the pain that we experience about our lives is based on the narrative we're carrying about our lives.
Yeah.
Okay, so which isn't to say that it's just as easy as, well, like change the story in your head and you'll be happy. It's not simple like that.
Yeah.
But it is the idea that the narrative has been delivered to us as a social construct from someone who had the power to define what the story should be. And then through us collecting evidence. So if you believe that you're a piece of crap, and that came to you through your family, you'll start to look for and find evidence. And there may be other people who support that story.
It becomes self-reinforcing.
But so what he always says is the problem is the problem, not the person. And what I love that when I encountered it, that the person is not the problem. The problem is the problem. And the problem is not a part of you. It is, or is not you. It is the narrative that's been delivered to you and that you're now reinforcing.
Yeah.
But probably other people are reinforcing too.
Yeah. So that's the kind of the essence of how narrative therapy.
Yeah.
So how does that play out then when, this is obviously we're fast forwarding here. Now you have a room full of aspiring writers. What do they show up with? Like, what do you see when they show up with the narratives? I've described it as like, with respect to masculinity, I've inherited a masculine mythology. Yep. And mythology, this is from some of what you've taught me, but mythology is a way of telling a story about how people experience reality. It's not always the only one or the clearest one, but like, what do you see when writers show up and become a part of your narrative project?
Well, what was so fun, I didn't know this was going to happen, Tom, but what I discovered when I started the program is that the dilemmas that I would have been dealing with in therapy on this very slow path to unpacking the problematic narratives that people bring into the therapy room, in the writing process, with the idea that someday someone is going to read your story. In other words, there's a built-in idea of an audience. An audience is always important when it comes to story, right?
Yeah.
There's the built-in idea that someday someone will receive your book and they will read it and they will be in a relationship with your content, with your story, that makes people look at the page for a narrative arc. And a narrative arc, by definition, means that when you start in one place, you come out transformed on the other side. So you know this, that the first draft is what I call the catharsis draft. You just dump that thing on the page. But we start you with what we call the guiding question. So what is the question this main character, you, in the case of a memoir, is asking? What do they need to know? What's their driving desire? The problem they need to escape or the story they need to change? And you write through that story. And then once you get through that catharsis draft, you got to go back and revise it. So you are literally revising your story. And so the literality of that, I think what I've seen is that people fast track their therapy.
Yeah.
I didn't mean that to happen, but that is what has happened. That's what happens.
Do you see this leading at some point to a different kind of like therapeutic approach? Not everyone, everyone has capacity to write coherently. Not everyone can be an author.
Right.
But do you see this loop? You see this bringing you back to that, then the therapeutic part, or because you're such an artist too?
Yeah. It's funny you asked that because we're just designing a program that we're calling Writing for Healing, where I'm going to take people through the right, but not for publication. Because we have, as you know, I mean, our community is really full of love and vibrancy and all of that sort of thing. And yes, honest.
And badass women, I might add. Yes.
Indeed. But we want to open the doors also for people who don't need a book, but they do need the process.
Yeah.
So yeah, we're heading in that direction.
We'll be right back after these messages. Did you know we have a new show? Join us in listening to Shop Talk, an extension of the Masculine Wilderness podcast, where your host, Tom Perez, and me, your producer, Lauren Trantham, get together to talk about the behind-the-scenes action that goes on within the anti-trafficking movement, current events, and epic news. It's free to subscribe. Just head on over to our website at epicproject.org and sign up for our newsletter, and you will be automatically opted in to receive these private episodes. See you at Shop Talk. And now, back to the show.
You've had dozens and dozens of women participate. Yeah. How many men in total over the years?
Probably under 10.
So single digits.
Yeah.
Why do you think, I have my own theories, but why do you think this kind of process seems, maybe I'm making a wrong assumption here, but it seems more immediately accessible to women? Like they are capable of getting there sooner, it seems. But like, why, or am I not seeing something? It feels like a very gendered, the experience is different, and that seems to be a gendered thing.
Yeah. You know, I immediately have two feelings about that. Question's a great question. Because as you know, I love the dudes, big fan of men, and got all my brothers and their friends and many longtime friends who are men. But I think that there's two pieces to it. One is that I think men do have a voice in a way that women don't have a voice sometimes still in this day and age.
Yeah.
That women, through, the statistics, through abuse and control, have been silenced. And so there's I think a driving need when women hit a certain point in their lives to be able to unpack the story and to be heard.
Yeah.
But the other piece is also, I think that in women's culture, there already exists an opportunity for vulnerability with each other. So, I mean, as you probably know, because you've got daughters, women talk about everything.
Yeah.
So I think between those two things, we've drawn more women than men to the program, but our hearts are open to men.
Yeah, and I want to be clear. This is not a program for women writers.
Right.
It's a program for writers.
Right.
And the way the program is developed, it seems, like I said, it seems more accessible on the surface anyway.
Yeah.
To men, but I can attest to the experience of having been in it, that it's deep and I think in some ways frightening. It was frightening for me as a man to have to confront things that I've become really good at avoiding. Mm-hmm. Even just expressing emotions. And it's one thing to do that, like verbally, to say, this is how I'm feeling. It's another thing to write it, but it'd be, like you said earlier, like you're putting your story on the page to write out your emotional response that really calls for something that hasn't been called out of us very often. What other things has this process taught you about maybe some of the other differences that you see between how women versus men show up and wrestle with trauma and vulnerability and all of those things? What have you seen?
Let's see. That's a good question. I think because women also opt into therapy more often than men do. Mm-hmm. And I'm actually gonna back up to my work in therapy actually to answer that question. The men that I worked with in therapy over the years, my experience was that it took longer to build the trust.
With the men?
With men, yeah. So women oftentimes would come right into therapy. And I think because I'm a female therapist, they would come in and the bridge building, there still did need to be a bridge building. I mean, everybody comes with a different level of willingness to trust strangers. Mm-hmm. But my experience with women was that once the trust was there between us as people, then the vulnerability and the transparency would pretty readily follow. Whereas I can think of many men that I worked with in therapy where I understood pretty quickly after they came in, like, I'm going to need to be committed to building this trust. And I'm thinking of one man in particular who had a really hard abandonment story from one of his parents. And he came in because his partner had given him an ultimatum, like, get into therapy or get out. Mm-hmm. And when he came in, I asked him for his history and he told me, and I immediately felt this great compassion for where his wounds were coming from. Even though he was being angry in the house, I could see where the anger came from. Yeah. And it took me 6 months to build the rapport with him, to really give him permission to feel and that he would be safe showing an emotion. It's almost like he felt afraid to shed a tear. Yeah. And I can remember the moment in Breakthrough when he told me something about his childhood and I said, God, that just sounds hard. And one little tear dripped down his face. Yeah. And he said, it was hard. And I felt like we'd made a major breakthrough. Yeah. Now, the interesting thing that happened in that case is that later he brought his partner in and some angry episode was described. And I asked the partner to step outside and I said to my client, that's violence. And he got so angry that he got up and he marched out of the room. Mm. And I called him back later that week and I said, you know why I said that to you, right? And he said, yeah, I calmed down and I know why. It's because you actually love me. Wow. And I said, get back into my therapy room. Yeah. And he said, okay. And eventually this guy was like asking me for parenting advice. I mean, he really settled into the trust. Yeah. That was not unusual. That's not an unusual experience.
With male clients.
With men. I mean, I think the thing of it is, and I think you and I have talked about this before, Tom, a little boy is born and we do violence to his private parts, most men, right away.
8 days.
Yes, to his penis. And then we give men this message. This makes me feel sad to talk about because I have my brothers that I love
Yeah.
so much. We give men this message. You're both at the top of the food chain. You get to be the boss, but also you're completely disposable if we need you to go to war. There's this weird mixture of you have something special and you don't.
Yeah. And you're disposable.
And you're disposable. Yeah. I think the narrative is really confusing for men.
I never thought of those two things together. Yeah. And it's generation after generation too.
Right.
We think of, I only knew one set of grandparents, my mother's father, who I loved dearly. And he was a wonderful, kind man that I didn't really know him, but he was stern.
Stern. Yeah.
And proper, and was all about being polite and neat, but like emotional connection, there really wasn't there.
Yeah.
And my dad didn't know his parents, was also very stoic, but there were a couple of experiences in my life where I saw this surprising emotion from him that wasn't anger usually, and my kids would probably say the same thing about me. Most of the emotion that we saw was anger. But I remember an experience with my dad that was really emotional, and it wasn't anger, and it still stands out to me. This was Thanksgiving weekend, 1978. I had flown home from my freshman year of college, where I went away and showed up to play football at the University of Montana, and surprisingly earned a full scholarship. Like, I was a walk-on before people knew what that was. And I was coming home, this conquering hero, but I remember this. So this was 1978. So, everybody came to the gate, right? This is O'Hare Airport. And I can remember I got off the plane and I had bought because it's Montana and I'm from Illinois, I bought a big gnarly Stetson hat, and so I'm walking through and just the sea of people, and all of a sudden coming towards me, the people are separating, like something's coming after me. And it was my dad running to hug me. And he hit me so hard that my hat, my expensive Stetson hat, went flying off. And I had never seen my dad run with excitement. I seen him run on the baseball field, but like he just bear hugged me and almost just knocked me over.
That's sweet.
And I remember I always I think for me, emotion, that's a real touch point for me, because like the emotion's there.
Right.
It was always there with my dad. It's always there with me. People talk about men not expressing emotions, and it's not that we don't feel.
Right.
We feel all of them. We just oftentimes don't know what they are. We're afraid to show them. We feel like we need permission. There's so many things. It's just so hard it's just hard to do that naturally. But you see a difference, back to the earlier question of what you see in the therapy room.
Yeah.
And you see a difference with a cohort of writers too.
I do. Yeah. I mean, I think your story is so this super sweet, touches me. Even the little moment with my brother where he got mad and said he was going to storm out. Once I glared him into sitting down again, before too long, we got below what was below the anger.
Yeah.
And what was below the anger was his sense that he's always worried about not being valued, And so we could sit there and say but I value you, right? Like, how can I give you that experience, and how can you open yourself to it?
Yeah.
And I think that in the narrative project, through the small groups, that it's a 9-month relationship that you have. And we teach people how to use language and critique that is not criticizing a person, but is giving critique to what's on the page.
Yeah.
So I think that slowly builds trust. And I think you ended up really trusting the women in your group.
And they trusted me. One of the gals, especially, she revealed in a chapter something she had never told any man before.
Wow.
And I felt so honored and trusted. And I said, has any man ever heard this story before? And she goes, no. And just like the privilege of that was absolutely amazing for me. And I think the other thing that for me, and this has become a theme for me just in the work that I've been doing the last few years, is I felt like I am in healthy, authentic, sexual relationships with women. Like I have friends that are women, and that has always been the case for me. But even with a room full of women I'd never known and really had nothing in terms of life experience or anything like that, nothing in common with. But what it taught me is that I have the capacity as a man to enter into those kind of relationships with women as a friend, as a mutual friend. And I think like with the work we do at Epic, one of the things we see is that because that's not a very common experience among men, we tend to, just kind of comply with the usual gendered order of things in our world, that men are, I don't, what am I trying to say there? It's just not, it was not, I didn't expect that kind of relational investment in me from women and vice versa. And I think that's something that's missing in our wider culture. I think that's a story that needs to be told more, that we have the capacity, and you may be because you've read and written a lot more than I have, but like, when was the last time there was a really compelling movie about friendship between a man and a woman that didn't end with a sex scene?
Right.
Right?
Right.
Like, has that ever happened?
It makes, the one that comes to my mind is My Best Friend's Wedding,
Yeah, it's
How does that end? I can't remember.
close, maybe. Yeah. The other one the other picture that comes to mind that is, I think, closer to it is Ted Lasso.
Oh, yeah.
And his relationship with who's the owner of the team. What's the character's name? I forget.
I can't think of it either.
Yeah, but it's Ted and the team owner is a man and a woman. That's closer to it that I've seen, and it's such a compelling thing. Why are stories like these, why are they so compelling and enduring, and why do they shape us, the good ones and the bad ones? Like, what is it about stories?
Well, what I was going to say, Tom, and I'll circle back to the story piece. I was going to say that what you did by joining the Narrative Project and being willing to be in a space that is, I'll use the word dominated by women.
Just me and the girls.
Yeah, just you and the girls, is that you open a portal for a new narrative, right? Every time we are vulnerable with one another and it goes well, even if it's hard, we shift the narrative. So stories are important because they're our whole unit for meaning making.
That's so good. Say that one more time.
Stories are important because they're our whole unit of meaning making. They're the building blocks for how we think of our lives. So if we have a story that men and women can't be friends, I can't tell you how many times I've had people say to me, but do you really think that a man and a woman can be just friends? And I've said, I 100% know it. My entire life, I have friends that I've known since the second grade.
Yeah.
And it's never needed to turn sexual. I'm friends with some of their partners, both men and women partners, and not with all of them. It doesn't matter. But that's the story we're telling ourselves about this relationship. It's the story that we're telling ourselves about what's possible between people. And those stories are socially constructed. We're more in charge of them than we think we are, even though there are power structures. I mean, obviously, people with the bigger bullhorns and more money, they can shout louder and tell a certain story. But we can subversively tell other stories.
Yeah. How do we subversively do that?
Well, you're doing it. You're absolutely doing it. I mean, and the book that you're writing, you're willing to look at the narrative that was delivered to you about what it means to be a masculine man.
Yeah.
And you're willing to unpack that, own your masculinity, but redefine what it means as an ally, as a friend, as a lover, as a dad, as a leader in the community. And you're doing it collaboratively rather than power over. And that's not going to happen that way every single time. I mean, we're all going to go back to the narrative that was delivered to us periodically, but you're committed to changing your relationship with that narrative.
Yeah.
That's what it takes.
I love that. You said unit of meaning making. It's how we make meaning out of our lives is by the stories that we tell. I know there have been too many to count, I think at this point, occasions with our Epic volunteers where they're literally talking to active sex buyers. And one of the most And we stumbled upon this long before I ever met you, but one of the most powerful things you can do to engage another man, just in a man-to-man conversation, is say, hey, what's your story? Not in an accusatory kind of way, but our volunteers just intuitively said, I'm going to ask that question. And it just unlocked so much in terms of the conversations and the impact that they've had, just to say, what's your story? Because we all have one.
Yeah.
And that's super helpful. I love the part of your story that involves running shoes and travel. Can you tell us that story that is in your book? Tell us the name of the book.
Okay. So my first book is called Second Wind, One Woman's Midlife Quest to Run 7 Marathons on 7 Continents.
Sure. What could go wrong? Because you're an elite runner, right?
Sure. No, I am a very slow back of the packer. And probably by now, one of my favorite quotes, and I hope I get this right, is by G.K. Chesterton: anything worth doing is worth doing badly.
So what was the impetus for that? Like 7 marathons on 7 continents?
Kind of one of the primary, like if I had a manifesto, it's baked into this story. So originally I was a regular exerciser and a runner, but when I got divorced the first time, I've been married a couple times, I was challenged by a friend who I ended up marrying to run a full marathon. And I had always promised myself I would never run a full marathon because I had run a couple of half marathons and they beat the hell out of me. So I said no at first, but he said, well, what if we go to Prague and run it? And I'm a sucker for traveling. I'll do almost anything for travel. And so I said, okay, well, so I trained for this marathon. And that first marathon was literally one of the hardest things that I've ever done in my life. My legs burned. There was a moment during the race, he ran the whole thing with me. There was a moment during the race where I said, my legs hurt. And he said, yeah, that's how it's supposed to be. And I said, I don't think you understand. Like, they really hurt. And he said, yeah, that's how it's supposed to be. And so I finished the marathon and kind of promised myself I'd never do another one until he called me and said, how about a marathon in Australia? So this got me started on running marathons. But one of the things that I learned after the second one, the one in Australia, and by now I've done probably around 40 marathons.
Oh, wow.
One of the things that I learned is that two things really. You cannot run a race. You cannot run a long race for anyone else. You have to dig deep and find your own motivation for doing it, right? Yeah. You can't just do it because somebody bribes you with travel. You absolutely have to dig deep and find what it means to you. And secondly, you cannot run a race at anyone else's pace. You have to find your own authentic pace and be true to yourself there. So I discovered that I was a back of the packer, and I've committed to doing this thing, which brings so much meaning to me. So much. The way I think about it, Tom, is that every time I go out there and I beat my feet on the ground, I'm letting go of the things that do not serve me, and I am pulling up goddess energy from the center of the earth.
In the form of blisters and muscle cramps.
Yeah.
Wow. So do you have one on the calendar currently that you're
I
training
don't
for?
have one on the calendar currently. Right now, I'm committed to getting in about 30 miles a week, which will keep me ever ready for a half marathon. And I'm looking for one to do January, February. And then my goal before next August is to find a 50 miler and run it.
Yeah. Go big or go home. I am a marathoner trapped in a football player's body.
I love it.
I have the brain for it. I think I just don't have the body. But you have inspired me, because I did have a what would Cami do moment when I looked at recently a 100-mile gravel bike race.
Yes.
Which I am going to sign up for and do in the end of April. So it was my what would Cami do moment. So I'm gonna attempt that.
Oh, that's great. Where is that? Where's that going to be?
It's in the high desert, kind of eastern Oregon, near the Dalles.
Okay.
So it'll be just out in the high desert.
It's in April.
Yeah, in the wind and rain. So
I love that.
Yeah. So you've kind of Well, I don't know, maybe this isn't the case. Usually I want to ask our guests, like, what do you do that's unique and life-giving for you? And I know you well enough to know that running is a part of that. Are there other things for you? And I can't remember what it's called, but before we started recording, there is something else that is really life-giving for you. What is that?
So besides travel too, bachata. I dance a dance called bachata. Yes. It's a dance originated in the Dominican Republic. It's a Latin dance.
Okay.
Yeah. So danced in pairs. Yeah. So I go to the dance clubs here in Seattle and
that's the other part of me. My heart is Cuban. I'm half Cuban, but my hips are Dutch. Ask my wife. I was a little bit like Frankenstein when I dance. She's very patient with me, but that's so good. Yeah. I want to give you the last word, and I'm going to do it selfishly as the wizard that showed up and that knows the power of storytelling. What can you say? What would you like to say to men about their stories?
Yeah. Thank you. Tom, I wish that we could fill our program with more men. I have two men right now that I'm starting to work with, and both of them have stories of transformation coming from a constrained place to a place of freedom. And what I want to say is that if you're inclined to write your story, then you're called to write your story. You know this about me, that my belief is that when we consciously unpack and revise our stories, that we're contributing to a shift in the collective consciousness. So when I'm just going to use you as an example because I know you, as you write this book, as you do this podcast, as you change yourself and share with other people the ways in which you're embracing a different kind of masculinity, you're shifting the collective unconscious. The changes that we make on ourselves and the stories that we tell to one another, they don't go into a void. They connect with other people's stories because stories are socially constructed. So we really need men to consciously tell their stories, whether it's verbally or in writing.
Yeah.
That's my encouragement.
I so appreciate that. Cami, you are a blessing. You're a wizard. And I'm really glad you showed up in my story. And I'm not the only one that feels that way. So
thank you, Tom.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Masculine Wilderness Podcast with your host, Tom Perez. This podcast is a production of Epic Project, a nonprofit organization dedicated to disrupting the demand for commercial sexual exploitation and dismantling the forces that perpetuate it. I'm your producer, Lauren Trantham. Special shout out to our favorite logo designer, Michelle Boucher, as well as Wes Finley, who crafted and donated our amazing theme song. Interested in sponsoring an episode? Send us an email at podcast@epicproject.org. That's podcast@epikproject.org. As a nonprofit organization, your donations allow us not only to produce this podcast and change the conversation around sexual exploitation, but also to manage our many programs, such as buyer intervention, teen prevention, and community education. Your support also allows us to support survivors of exploitation and more. To learn more about our work and to donate, visit www.epicproject.org. Once again, that is www.epikproject.org. Most importantly, this podcast would be nothing without you, the listener. Thank you for tuning in, subscribing, and sharing this episode with your friends and loved ones. Thank you for your commitment to learning more about the issues that affect our most vulnerable populations. Thank you for navigating this masculine wilderness with us. See you next episode.